Free to Disagree campaign. I'm your host, Jamie Gillies. We're asking the experts for their take on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill to provide a resource for you, the public, to know more about the legislation and be informed about it. This is the second discussion we've hosted here at Free to Disagree, the first being with Iain Murray of the Society of Editors and John McClellan of the Scottish Newspaper Society. That was a fascinating discussion, and I'd encourage you to go and check it out if you didn't get a chance to watch it last week. You can view it on our YouTube channel. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by two more people from the world of journalism, two heavyweights, two behemoths at the coalface of journalism in Scotland, Kevin McKenna and Iain Macwhirter. Kevin is a freelance journalist who writes for The Herald, The National, and has written for The Observer for many years. And Iain writes for The Herald and The Herald on Sunday, and he was a political correspondent for the BBC at both Westminster and Holyrood in the past. Thanks very much for joining me today, folks.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Now, the format for this discussion is pretty straightforward. We'll talk about the hate crime bill and your thoughts upon the legislation. I'll pick your brains about the political process. I'm expecting great things because you're both political pundits. And if we have time, perhaps we can talk a bit more about free speech in Scotland more widely. Kevin, I'll maybe start with you. So you've written a couple of fairly strong columns in the Herald recently on the hate crime bill and given your views. Can you just tell us your thoughts on the bill and what you perceive to be problems with it?
Well, first of all, it just seemed to me initially quite unnecessary. You know, I mean, Iain may correct me here, but I hadn't really seen this signalled too much in SNP circles. You know, where the subject of hate speech and hate crime, especially with the offensive behaviour at football, has been around for a few years. But unless I was missing something, I wasn't seeing some of the issues that this is addressing featuring a great deal in SNP nationalist circles. And I'm wondering, you know, where this was coming from, why they felt it was necessary. Do they think that this is a vote winner? Do they really think that there is a major problem across Scotland, a real particular problem that has to be addressed in, I would say, a fairly drastic way? Because when you look at the wording of it, it's so wide open to interpretation, and you're left thinking, so who's going to interpret here? Especially when they use phraseology such as intended to or likely to stir up hatred. I mean, for instance, the Justice Secretary, Hamza Yusuf, said that, I think he wrote a letter to was it the Herald or was it the Scotsman, where he said he was trying to defend this when the first raft of objections began to become apparent. And he said the new stirring up hatred offences for the other characteristics use a threshold that the conduct must be threatening or abusive and intended or likely to stir up hatred. So actions must either be threatening or abusive before the new stirring up hatred offences can be committed. Now that to me presages a whole raft of trouble. I can understand why the legal profession is unhappy with this because, and I've spoken to a couple of lawyers who say the amount of court time that will be wasted in what they expect to be a glut of cases, vexatious cases brought by special interest groups to test it, they think is completely unnecessary and could, be quite a lot of trouble ahead in that area. So I just found it unnecessary, and I was quite surprised that it came as it did and with that sort of wording. And I was wondering, you know, how much time, effort, thought have they put into this?
Iain, same question to you. What's your assessment of the bill?
Yeah, well, I share Kevin's bewilderment, really, puzzlement about why the SNP has been pushing through a raft, really, of illiberal and repressive measures. I mean, Kevin mentioned the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, which crashed and burned and had to be repealed after one sheriff described it as mince. As a piece of legislation which was just simply not possible to translate into law and was profoundly offensive to working people at football grounds. And it's almost as if having you know, found that didn't succeed, they've tried to create a kind of offensive behavior for everyone act, which is what this is really, because it's very, very similar. It's just saying that you know, if you say something that's not, even without intending to, if you just say something that might be likely to cause offense, or if it's to do with race, cause insult, which is really disturbing, then, you know, you can be up for a 5-year sentence in jail. And again, like the OFBA, I'm sure this will be unworkable in practice. It'll be used by people for, and you know, to make a point. We've already had people saying they're waiting for this bill to become law so that they can have a go at the Bible, and they can claim that the Bible is offensive to people, which, if you take it literally and if you go minutely through all the sections of the Old Testament, you can find anything that could be offensive to lots of people, you know, and so you can just see how this is going to be used for vexatious purposes. And I'm sure that's exactly what will happen. Why are the SNP doing this? Why do they have this illiberal streak? I'm not quite sure. There is something a bit disturbing there. We saw it not just with the Offensive Behaviour Act, but also with the Named Persons Act, which was an attempt to basically provide a guardian for every child in Scotland to make sure that they are consulted if their rooms are painted, but was seen rightly, I think, by many social workers and teachers as being an attempt to sort of devolve to them, to make them the first line of defense against child abuse. And once they realized that, once they clocked that, they were very opposed to it. And actually, that's not what led to its downfall. It was actually basically a ruling from under the ECHR, under human rights legislation, which did for that. So why are they doing this? I can only think it's partly because the SNP, not being a particularly ideological party, I mean, because its objective is independence, it tries to get as many groups as possible into the tent. And therefore it's continually looking for outside interests to bring into the tent, to try to appeal to them, to appease them, if you like, and try to get them to support it. I mean, we saw this with LGBT and with this whole transgender issue. Again, that's a number of client groups which the SNP has over the years, the Scottish Government has over the years financed, and it's kind of outsourced its policy agenda to these groups, and they come back with these measures. And it thinks, well, we have to do this because we want to keep these people sweet because they might support us in our cause for independence. But it is very worrying, and I think this is probably the worst example of it so far. And one final point, and you can kind of tell this because when are they putting this legislation through? During a COVID pandemic. I mean, you know, if they have time for this, when the entire resources of the Scottish Government is supposed to be devoted to combating this disease, I think you can tell there's something sneaky going on.
Yeah. I mean, on your point about trying to please different interest groups, if you like, something that we were talking about yesterday, Kevin, was the fact that the Scottish public are completely unimpressed with this legislation and with the similar legislation that you talked about, Iain, as well. There seems to be quite a misalignment, if you like, between the government's priorities and the people's priorities. And that's something which we've seen in our own polling of people, because you find that the vast majority of Scots really value free speech, and the key parts of the hate crime bill which are controversial, they don't support. Now, both of you have been on the block, if you like. You've been political pundits for many years, and you've seen the passage of legislation and controversial legislation, some of which you've touched on, Iain. What's your assessment of how this is going to play out politically? It's interesting that criticism of the bill has come from both the political right and the political left, and from different philosophical groups as well, from Christians and atheists and humanists. And it's not often that you get such a diverse canvas of people who are exercised against government policy. So what do you think how do you think this is going to go down in the Scottish Parliament? What do you think the other opposition parties are going to want? Do you think the government ultimately can get this legislation through? Or, in your experience, how's it going to go down?
Well, I was speaking to a senior Labour MSP last night, and she was indicating that there's quite a lot of angst within the Labour Party in Scotland about this, and they were interested in Nicola Sturgeon's comments yesterday, talking about, possibly considering any amendments, which was actually, although it didn't seem to say much, it's actually quite significant, because I can't recall a similar occasion regarding similar types of legislation where the First Minister has said, almost inviting amendments. That may be just posturing. In the normal course of events, I would expect this bill either to go the way of the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act eventually, or for it to be denuded of some of its more problematic aspects and terminology. But there's two things here, which leads me to think that the people who are pushing this think they might have a chance of steering through the choppy waters and bringing it to fruition. One you talked about is coronavirus. The SNP would be expecting to have an October conference in October. Their autumn conference in October. That's highly unlikely to happen if it hasn't already been knocked on the head. Now, there's a major problem within the SNP, a lot of civil strife regarding the makeup and the powers of their National Executive Committee. And in the normal course of events, if that conference was going ahead, I would have expected several individuals currently on the NEC to be voted off because of issues such as, targeting Joanna Cherry returning to Holyrood by making it virtually impossible for an MP at Westminster to come back, Gender Recognition Act, etc. But that's not going to happen, and therefore the NEC, the makeup of the NEC will probably remain. And then the next thing is the election, and the polls which are indicating an overwhelming electoral majority for the SNP next May. I've already heard the SNP people say, well, look, these polls are more or less an endorsement of our social and cultural agenda, which includes GRA, which includes hate legislation, that the public aren't fooled. They know the issues, and they're still indicating that they'll vote for us. Therefore, they're giving us carte blanche to pursue this. And you lot are just a very small kind of permanently discontented white 50-somethings, and your day is gone, and this is what it's all about now. But the problem with that, of course, is that when you speak to people outside the political bubble, which is about 99.9% of the population, they're completely and utterly unaware of, for instance, Gender Recognition Act, and also some of the fine print in the proposed hate bill. And that's the way certain people in the SNP want it. They want these bills or this legislation to progress by stealth, and as few people who know about it, the better for them. I was speaking to my mum the other night, and I was trying to spell out some of the niceties of this legislation, and she said, "But that wouldn't happen. They just can't. You can't do that." And I said, "Mum, it's happening. It's happening right now." It's going, "Well, what can we do?" She was saying, "Well, because everybody's concentrating on the epidemic, there's going to be precious few opportunities to do anything about it. So one of the first things I'll do is ask her to click on this link and get following your organisation."
Oh, that's good to hear. Iain, so how's this going to play out politically?
Hamza Yusuf has said that, as Kevin indicated, he's prepared to accept some amendments on this. As far as he's told me, it's relating to this intent aspect, and he's going to beef up the intent aspect, because as Kevin has also said, that the peculiarity of this piece of legislation is that, intent is not required. I mean, this means that you can stir up hatred without even being aware of it, just by saying something which is likely to cause offense. And something likely, I mean, anything is likely to cause offense. I mean, jokes about Scots, Irish and Welsh people in a bar could conceivably cause offense to some people, or could be seen as insulting, which is another iniquitous aspect of this legislation, that as far as race is concerned, merely insulting somebody could be construed as likely to stir up hatred and therefore be a criminal offence. I mean, this is just astonishing, particularly for the SNP, because another thing that people are waiting to do is to say, well, the Scottish National Party, they're stirring up hatred against English people. Just look at what's been happening at the border, and taking out vexatious legal suits on that basis. I mean, introducing all these woolly concepts of the criminal law is outrageous, and I'm astonished that so many people in the SNP, and many of whom have legal training, have gone along with this. Particularly given, as we've said, the antecedents, the fact that they've been down this road so many times before, and they simply don't seem to be prepared to learn from it. And I think what they'll do, and again, I think Kevin's right here, we can tell what the game plan is to maneuver Labour into proposing amendments, and then try to accuse Labour, oh, well, you're soft, and go around or get quotes, take them out of context and suggest that the opposition parties are quite happy for people to go around abusing people of a different race, and are quite happy to go around stirring up hatred, but they don't care about hatred. And this is a tactic they used with the named persons and the OFBA. Anyone who criticizes it is deemed, therefore, to be somebody who is basically racist and is basically sexist, or is if it's the Gender Recognition Act, that you must be, if you oppose it in any way, then you must be a transphobe. I'm sure we'll get onto that later on, because that has very much been it's been a very touchstone issue within the SNP, completely obscure to the rest of the nation, as Kevin says, but has been causing all sorts of problems there. So I think they'll struggle. They'll get this onto the statute book, though for what purpose, I can't understand, because another thing Hamza Yusuf says is that, well, they'll make it clear in the final legislation that this has to be threatening, and this stirring up hatred has to be threatening and abusive. It has to be established that it is threatening and abusive, contradicting the other purpose of the bill, which is to basically make anything which is seen as offensive illegal. So it's got to be threatening and abusive. But of course, threatening and abusive language is already illegal. So the idea that I think this is what will happen. This will get onto the statute book. It will basically be a repetition of a recapitulation of hate crime legislation that already exists, because, and I'd like to mention this later, we already have a massive hate crime legislation most people aren't aware of. and this will be a recapitulation of it. There'll be a few test cases which will end in great legal confusion, and then it'll be left to sit on the statute book quietly for many years. Because another thing with all these cases, what you keep hearing ministers saying is they want to use the law to send a message. And in fact, they don't really care. This is a public relations exercise. They don't really care about the law, the criminal law, its coherence, or whether this is whether it's going to be possible to actually apply this law. What they want to do is send a message, and they're sending a message to a client group, and they're saying, look, we've put through the hardest, the toughest hate crime legislation in history. Okay, maybe completely useless, but there it is, and therefore vote for us.
Yes, that's fascinating, Ian. I think with Humza Yousaf making the point about threatening and abusive language, so he was criticised for that because the language of the bill is threatening or abusive. So a criminal offence is abusive and likely to stir up hatred. So there's so much vagueness and subjectivity in that statement. And with the term abusive itself, if you look up abusive in the dictionary, that's rude and insulting language. And we talked, I think, last week a little bit about the hate crime framework which exists in Scotland already, and the reporting of hate incidents to the police. So obviously non-crime incidents where somebody perceives that something said somewhere by anybody was motivated by hatred, and they can report that to the police. And the political atmosphere that we have at present being a problem if the hate crime legislation comes into force, because you've got this background of politically motivated reporting and different things. We've kind of covered it a little bit already, but I wanted to just touch on Nicola Sturgeon's comments yesterday, which we found interesting because, Humza Yousaf has been fairly conciliatory over the last couple of months. He said regularly that he's willing to meet and to discuss legitimate concerns about the bill. But Nicola Sturgeon gave an assurance yesterday that she would listen carefully to critics. She said that the freedoms of speech and of expression are fundamental in any democracy, which is good to hear. And later, when she was asked by Liam Kerr, the Tory justice spokesperson, if she would drop the legislation, she didn't go into combat mode. She said, if we need to lodge amendments to reassure people who have legitimate concerns, we give an undertaking to do so. That's something which sounds like a concession of sorts to me. I don't think you see that sort of conciliatory position very often from the Scottish Government, because often they don't need to do that. So we may have chatted about this already slightly, but do you think that it could be the case that the government are open to accepting the kind of amendments that we've been calling for, that other groups have been calling for, and they just want to put this to bed? Or is that too optimistic?
I think there is a kind of toxic cartel who wield disproportionate influence inside that party, inside the NEC, and if they possibly can, if they can see a route through this to retain as much of the essence of the legislation as possible, they will. These people are not in the mood for compromise. You just have to look at some of the responses that they and their supporters, or how they respond to the likes of J.K. Rowling or Joanna Cherry in their own party, for heaven's sake, to show that compromise to them is a sign of weakness. But when you have the First Minister, when the leader of the party saying this, and the power that Nicola Sturgeon has within the SNP cannot be overstated. She has more control and more power and influence over that her own party than any other party in the UK, by virtue not simply of being leader, but by being married to the party's chief executive. But yeah, I would like to. I would hope that some sanity prevails here, and you know, these kind of uncertainties, especially the phrase "is likely to," is tightened up, because you know, I couldn't see a judge, any judge in Scotland, thinking that this legislation, the way it is currently drafted, is a good idea.
Yeah, you've had the Law Society and the Faculty of Advocates come out pretty strongly already. Iain, what about you?
Well, which amendments are you talking about?
So, I mean, the kind of amendments that have mainly been spoken about in the debate are requiring intent for an offence to be committed. We're calling for the term abusive to be dropped because we think that's problematic. I mean, ultimately, our favourite amendment would be that Part 2 is actually just withdrawn from the bill. So that, I mean, there are other non-controversial elements of the bill which aggregate, that you add in an additional aggregated offence of age, and sort of pulling together existing provisions. And we make the point that if the government were to scrap Part 2 of the legislation, the bill as a whole without Part 2 would achieve broad support and probably would sail through the Parliament pretty quickly. So yeah, what do you think are the chances of one, Part 2 being repealed, and two, very significant amendments being made, like requiring intent for offences to be committed and changing the language and the wording?
Well, as I said before, Hans Jufus seemed to indicate that he is prepared to think again on intent. So hopefully that would mean they would, they would have to prove that somebody had said something that may be construed as insulting or offensive, intended it to be that way. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure that and threatening and abusive. He actually now, I think he does talk about threatening and abusive, but I take your point that it's very difficult to know exactly what they're meaning there. But I think it's conceivable they could try tightening that up. But then, of course, if you do that, then they're basically just recapitulating the laws that already stand. So there's very little purpose. Now, since it's only for PR purposes, anyway, in my view, I don't think they've probably given a huge amount of thought to this. I think if they had given any thought to it, I don't think it would have gotten anywhere near legislation. But there, as Kevin said, there's obviously people who are quite influential in the party who are behind this, who want it. And it's a question of the balance of forces within the SNP and the extent to which Nicola Sturgeon wants to persevere with it. I mean, I'm just mystified that it's happened at all. So I'm like you, I would think, well, the obvious thing is to make these changes and to basically take away the objectionable aspects of the legislation. But since the objectionable aspects of the legislation appear to be the whole purpose of it, then I suppose I'm not terribly optimistic that that's going to happen. They might find some kind of, form of words which appears to accomplish both objectives. I don't really see that as being possible. See, I think this is partly going back to this whole thing that basically stems from the Macpherson report into institutional racism in the police in the late 1990s. This idea that it should be for the victims, quotes unquote, to determine what is offensive. And you mentioned the hate incidents issue. And that's the question there. If you look at how the police define now a hate incident, it's supposedly a non-crime hate incident. The way they define it is it's anything that a protected group regards as being offensive or constituting hatred, which can be absolutely anything, absolutely anything. I mean, as I say, quoting from the Bible, the classic case here, that people, people try to construe that as in some way hateful of them. Similarly, with any amount of existing literature, from Vladimir Nabokov to Hemingway, I mean, if you quoted any of that, you'd find people could construe that as being offensive to them. And the point is that they just have to say that, and it's immediately recorded as a hate incident.
Yeah, they have to. The police have to take it seriously.
They're required now to take it seriously and to record it. They record this hate incident. So that means that you have a hate incident recorded against your name, which will sit there on the police files until you perhaps you apply for a job as a primary school teacher. And when they're doing the enhanced disclosure, which is sort of investigating your entire life history to find out if you're a suitable person or not, up will pop this hate incident, which suggested that you'd been offensive to homosexuals because of something in the Bible or something like that. I don't know. Then, and that means, oh, hey, presto, you don't get the job, and you don't know why you haven't got it because you're not told any of this. You're not told how this information is used. So I think that's an awful lot to do with this whole drift of legislation. It's putting the onus, allowing the people to define themselves subjectively what is hateful and what should be regarded as a crime. So I think for that reason, I think it would be quite difficult for them to, as it were, totally neuter this bill, because making the changes you propose would obviously neuter it in those terms, because it would just recapitulate the laws that already exists. So I suppose I'm not terribly optimistic that the amendments will be accepted. Though I have to say, sorry to carry on, I don't mean to ramble on here, but I have to say though that this is actually quite, this is different from some of the previous pieces of legislation. I think Nicola Sturgeon's probably realised this. There's been much more opposition. And when you've got the Roman Catholic Church, the National Secular Society, the police, and the Law Society of Scotland all saying this is going to be damaging to free speech, and Nicola Sturgeon's favourite author, Val McDermid, then you're getting a pretty broad constituency of opposition. And, it may well be that she'll pop in, like the attempt to abolish corroboration of rape trials. She may pop in at the last minute and say, nah, just forget it.
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately our hope. And it's absolutely astonishing, as you say, just the diversity of people that have opposed this. All sorts of public figures and, from different parts of the political spectrum. And so that's our hope as well, obviously. Now, in the final part of the discussion, I wanted to get into slightly more broad chat about free speech in Scotland. So last week, John McClellan and Ian Murray both emphasised that they think free speech in Scotland is not having a good time of it, shall we say, in recent years. And they talked about the historic understanding of free speech, where there's no right not to be offended in life, essentially. So, just following on that discussion, what do you think about free speech in Scotland? Do you think free speech is under threat in Scotland more widely? And if you do, what do you think is behind that?
Yeah, I would say broadly, yes, it is, and this legislation is obviously one strand of that. I think social media, especially Twitter, has exaggerated, if you like, hate speech, unpleasantness, beastliness, unkindness. And we forget that what the last figures I saw were barely 10%, maybe 15% of the population are on Twitter. And so if you looked at Twitter and regarded that as a weather vane, regarded that as truly representative of the way that Scotland, civic Scotland, cultural Scotland conducts itself, behaves itself, engages with others, you may of course, you may conclude, wow, there's an awful lot of unpleasantness and hatred out there. They all hate each other, all want to fight each other. And for the most part, from what I can see, a lot of the people who are on Twitter or on Facebook, Instagram, before we had these platforms, the only way that you could express displeasure at a writer, for instance, or a journalist, was in the letters page of your newspaper. So, for instance, the Herald has a very vibrant letters page, and in years gone by, you know, debates could be carried on in the letters page for months on end. But unless you were very, very good at expressing yourself in the Queen's English, and it was and to a standard that was appreciated by, you know, an Oxford university educated letters editor, then you had no chance. You had no chance of expressing your disdain or hostility to something that I'd written, for instance. So we were basically a protected species, journalists. We could write anything, and next to nobody would have the opportunity to argue with us or to offer a counter argument. Social media has changed that, and now we are regularly called out, daily, on the hour, especially after we've written something and posted something, and politicians are too. Politicians are regularly called out, and they're accessed in a way that they never previously had been. And I think some of them look at that and say, we don't like this. This is vile, and we've got a serious problem in Scotland, when actually they don't. The tech companies have got a problem here. And touching something Iain was saying, one, we have existing legislation, but if they really did think that Scotland is disfigured by these waves of hatred running up and down the country every day, which it's not, if they really thought that, then they would make serious attempts at lobbying and making representation to the tech companies. And it would make serious attempts, basically calling in Police Scotland and saying, your algorithms, the technology that you already have, you should be doing something about this. So there's something going on here that most of Scotland doesn't recognise. It's not on Twitter, and when there are aspects of bad language, unpleasantness, it can provide a false portrayal of what's actually happening, and I think the SNP have fallen into this trap. But also, curiously, for a party that seems so keen to police and monitor our language, over the last year, several of its own MPs and MSPs, women, you know, have been subject to vile, threatening, intimidatory abuse, which actually Police Scotland, especially in the case with Joanna Cherry, have had to intervene and offer Joanna Cherry 24-hour protection at the 2017 election. Now, Joanna Cherry and several other people in the SNP have made official complaints to the party about this intimidation, vile, sexual, violent. And the last time I spoke to Joanna Cherry, not a single one of them has been entertained. So on one hand, you get this party who think that we're all hating each other so much that they've got to introduce this legislation. But when it has happened in their party, and it happens a lot in their party, and they know who is doing it, and these are SNP members, and some of them are connected, very close connections with SNP politicians, they've done nothing, absolutely nothing.
Iain.
Yeah, well, I agree with a lot of what Kevin's saying. And freedom of speech is always under threat under every regime, authoritarian and even nominally democratic, and it always has to be. Every generation has to be reinforced. The arguments have to be made again and again, as we see with things like the hate crime bill. The social media has an awful lot to do with it. As Kevin says, I don't know the figures, but there's 10% of the population is actually on Twitter, and yet 80% of the posts on Twitter are from a very small minority of the people on that. So it's a minority of a minority, and they're enormously influential. And you see that with the Gender Reform Act, which has basically got to the stage where you're redefining the entire nature of what it is to be human, what it is to be male, what it is to be female, what biology is, what science says about sex and male and female in a biological sense. So I mean, and they've been tremendously influential because they've managed to promote this on this platform on Twitter, and of course they're entitled to do that. That's absolutely fine. Everyone should make use of this marvelous new means of communication, which does give marginalized people a voice. However, it does depend on the people who are legislating, the people who are in government, the politicians, being robust enough to say sometimes this is nonsense, or this is just not acceptable. I mean, I think Christians find this particularly difficult. Now, I'm an atheist, so I don't have a particular line on this, but I respect Christians enormously because they have moral values which I think need to be discussed. I think particularly now, we do need moral debate, but Christians have been, there's still 600,000 Roman Catholics in Scotland. They've been completely excluded from debate because if they talk about anything, say, for example, abortion, they will be basically silent. They will be cancelled. I mean, in fact, Christians have effectively been cancelled in Scotland. Now, that's not just down to Twitter. It's down to the fact that the politicians, for some reason, and the media, I think the journalists are as much at fault here as anybody else, take Twitter storms tremendously seriously, and for some reason seem to regard Twitter as being representative of what people at large are thinking. And not that people on Twitter are just a tiny minority of a minority of very self-opinionated people who have often very eccentric and very dubious views. And so, seems to be the way in which, in our generation, the fight for freedom of speech has to be remade. Somehow we have to find a way of dealing with this new social media explosion without allowing it to close down debate in whole areas of life, which is what it is very much in danger of doing. I was rector of Edinburgh University, and I speak to many academics, and my successor as rector of Edinburgh University, this is why I became engaged with the trans rights issue, actually, because she was being targeted by groups in Edinburgh University, and she was being given, because she wasn't prepared to say that trans women are women, this dogma that everybody is supposed to subscribe to. She's a Labour Party feminist and said, I'm not really prepared to go along with that. And wouldn't say it in a rectorial address. And so she was targeted by these groups, and the university shamefully didn't support her. They just said, "Oh yeah, well we're opposed to homophobia and transphobia in all its forms," or something, some boilerplate refer like that. They didn't actually support her on it. And that's because for some reason, the university authorities, this is the University of Edinburgh, one of the top universities in the world, and it is so intimidated by a handful of people on Twitter that it will actually pervert its own principles and refuse to support the elected, because remember in Edinburgh, the rector is elected by the students and staff. They would refuse to support the elected representative of the institution itself at a grassroots level, which I just found that absolutely astonishing. And it's simply because of this, they're so intimidated by Twitter. And this has, reinforced this kind of cancel culture which exists in universities, where only a very, very narrow, and forget being a Christian in a university today, because you will immediately be labeled a bigot, a racist, and a homophobe. I mean, it's as simple as that. You just don't get to first base now if you declare yourself as being in any way influenced by that. And that's, this is a terrible situation we've got into. But as I say, it's the institutions themselves have to regain some of their own intellectual and moral self-confidence and try to face this down. Mm. Same with the SNP, because the SNP is subject to this too. They're all addicted to Twitter. They all spend all their time on social media, and they're all terrified in case they get attacked.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all you've said, Iain, and it's interesting. I think the issues that you've brought up with the gender recognition reform and cancel culture, and there's definitely a cross-pollination with the hate crime bill issue, because people like J.K. Rowling, who have taken a public stance, people like yourself, perhaps, if you've written about it. J.K. was very savagely attacked by activists, and that's cancel culture at work. The benefit, I suppose, of being J.K. Rowling is that you are well off, you've got a public profile, and you can probably weather the storm. But members of the Scottish public who make comments on the same issue or another controversial issue, and who are subjected to this abuse and intimidation and calls for their employer to terminate their contract and all sorts, they can't stand up to this. And that's the real chilling thing, that with the hate crime bill, you could get the activists who are attacking feminists and Christians and maybe other groups using the legislation to make vexatious complaints and malicious complaints, because they know that they can punish their political opponents through the law. And there's a wee video I made last week where I said that criminal legislation shouldn't be used in that way. It has to be clear. And we don't want to live in a society where people can use the criminal law to score political points. And it's as simple as that. And the police are being dragged into it as well. The Scottish Police Federation has been very clear about the role and the remit of the police. And it's not the role of the police to police people's private disputes and arguments and to decide what speech is legitimate. That's something out of 1984 to the Scottish Police Federation. And that's why they've been so strong against it. So, it's all very fascinating, and it's fascinating being part of this campaign. Because
why do you think that these institutions have been so intimidated by Twitter in particular, by social media?
It's an interesting question. I suppose you're right in that it's a small cohort of people that inhabit this online space, but it tends to be influencers, I guess, and people who have a big public profile. I suppose in terms of cancel culture, if you like, there's people who take certain stances are going to open themselves up to abuse. You guys are both journalists. You'll write things that people fundamentally disagree with and probably get pilloried online for it. And that's water off a duck's back, I suppose. But there is also a more sinister manifestation of that trend, intolerance of debate and dissenting views in society, and no platforming. And it seems to be a growing phenomenon, but it seems to also be a phenomenon which people are aware of increasingly, I think, and want to push back against. And I think it's fair to say that free speech is something that's talked about a lot, and there's quite a lot of initiatives today which are trying to rediscover and give life to free speech and classical free speech arguments, and to show that free speech is actually good for society. In terms of challenging hatred, the way that you challenge hate really is that you're able to robustly critique and attack and pull apart hateful and prejudiced statements by people. When they're out in the open, you can attack them and lay into them and show why they're wrong. If you suppress speech and drive these views underground, that's where they're going to fester. And I suppose that's a classical understanding of free speech. But yeah, I think it's very interesting, free to disagree, because there's lots of concern over the hate crime bill, but most of the concerns centre on free speech itself. And it's interesting to see the cross-section of society which support our campaign, and have spoken out on the hate crime bill. And the people who value free speech, the 99% who are not in the political classes, in the political, the Holyrood bubble, they really value free speech. If you support independence or the union, or you're a Labour guy or a Tory guy or whatever, free speech is something that brings people together. And so if our campaign can help to facilitate a bringing together of people in support of free speech, that's also going to be a desirable outcome for us. And in my own personal view, the political classes, they should really make the argument for free speech and value it, because these internal controversial debates that go on in parties, they're so bad because the parties don't tolerate difference of opinion. Political parties historically are places which are made up of people with very strong views and often very contrary, and people knocking chunks out each other, but still uniting behind broad political aims. And you don't really see that so much these days. I think there's an intolerance. I mean, there's a lot of talk about tolerance. That's one of the sort of buzzwords in politics these days, but it's not tolerance in the true sense that people talk about. It's tolerance of opposing views, and especially socially conservative views, I'd have to say, is lacking.
Tolerance has become zero tolerance.
Yeah, zero tolerance. And it's the same with, I suppose, in many parts of the media as well. The BBC is often accused of that kind of bias, if you like, or not having a real diversity of opinion on its platforms. But that's why it's so important that you guys write and continue to get your views out there and into the mix. I think we've strayed pretty far from the hate crime bill, but it's a very fascinating discussion. Probably leave it there. Thanks again for joining me, Kevin and Iain.
Thank you.
For more from Kevin and Iain, you can check out their Twitter pages. I've got the handles here; they'll be in the description below, at K McKenna 63 and at Iain Macwhirter. And for more, please be nice and kind to them if you visit their Twitter pages. For more information on the hate crime bill, visit our website www.freetodisagree.scot. Until next time, Marsh and Lave, goodbye.